About an hour later, we finally reached our retreat location. We had had this retreat location for a couple of years before the attacks, and our group had minimums that each family had to have pre-stored down there. So we were pretty good on food and clothing and needed medicines and soap and the such. And in actuality, the stuff that we had brought down with us from our homes were just added benefits. But the one thing we didn't work out and plan ahead were patrol schedules and chore responsibilities and other tasks such as those. So as we unpacked and got our supplies straightened, a couple of us volunteered to take patrol of the property the first night. Then as several days passed, we slowly got things worked out. We worked out what nights who would do the cooking and the cleaning and who would be responsible for hauling water, our patrol shifts, and who would monitor radio traffic, etc. Pretty soon, weeks had passed out here, and we were pretty much left alone. We would hear the occasional car traveling down the country road in the distance, but we never heard any of them stop. And when we did venture outside of the retreat to explore up and down the country roads around our area, we would see the occasional local person, but we never saw anything like the National Guard. And I think we only saw one beat-up small-town squad car go by. As much as the government wants us to believe that they could have a cop on every street corner and in every town and across the United States, they just can't. Even when the government has lots of tax revenue coming in to pay everybody, they just don't have the manpower to do that. So in times of social upheaval, they concentrate them in heavily populated areas where most of the trouble is located. And as the months passed by, we had our gardens going pretty good. And we also had a pretty good system going for cooking our food and collecting our water. And this is where our practice of gardening and canning and seed preserving and other self-reliant skills were paying off. Now, while we had to break out printed how-to books on some subjects, we didn't have that much of a learning curve on the major life-sustaining things such as growing food and purifying water. And as the months went by, we began slowly getting to know our neighbors. And while this was a fairly remote area, there were some farmhouses around the area, and we were just a couple of miles away from a very small town that still had a barely operational hospital and a few other businesses that were still actually open. When we actually traveled to meet neighbors during the day, we always moved with our handguns concealed. We usually walked or bicycled as gas was expensive and money was hard to come by. But whoever was doing our foot patrols around the retreat property were always armed with rifles and full battle rattle. Now, one thing that we did learn was that there was quite an uptick of new people in the area, besides us. People living in the country and the nearby town had some of their city-dwelling family members come and move in with them to get them out of the dangerous cities. And as a result, there was also an uptick of crime that came with it. But for the most part, everything was pretty non-eventful during our time at the retreat. We did our patrols, and everybody did their part to help with the cooking and the cleaning and preparing for the next winter. Everything was all about trying to stay a full year ahead of everything. And this was purposely done just in case the garden failed, or just in case we ended up experiencing an extra long or extra cold winter. Then one early morning, just before sunrise, shots suddenly rang out on the west perimeter of the retreat. Our patrol had radioed in that they had found a couple of adult males on the land, and one of them had a shotgun and had taken a shot at the patrols as they ran. And our patrol opened fire, but the people ran off. We didn't even know that at least one of them were hit until we found a little bit of blood on the ground the next morning when the sun came out. And we also found the shotgun shell where the firefight had happened. Now the worry set in. Did this injured person die somewhere? And if so, did they make it home before they died? Or did they just go off and die somewhere else? And would they come back? Or would their family come back looking to exact revenge? Would a group of armed men come back looking to settle a score? If they didn't die, would they tell what remaining law enforcement there was a lie about what happened? But over the next several months, nothing happened. Life as we now know it went back to normal. There was the cooking, cleaning, chopping firewood, gardening, and constant planning. And after that, we battled illnesses and injuries. Simple injuries could kill you due to infection if not properly treated. and illnesses that were simple before now turned into pneumonia that could kill you. Life now was very hard. We weren't quite living like it was the 1800s, but the United States was living like a third world country where the countryside was not as safe anymore, where electricity and water was still being rationed, and wherever there was a large amount of people living, you would find large amounts of trash and filth and crime. The average person didn't have cushy jobs anymore. Now you have to work hard to survive. And for the people that did have actual jobs, they were in businesses that dealt with necessities, like working for a power company, or a hospital, or a small grocery store, or something like that. And there was still the internet, but most people didn't have it in their homes now. If you wanted to use the internet, you had to go to an internet cafe and pay to use it. But while everybody was dirt poor, people were making it. If it wasn't for the fact that it got so dangerous at night in and around the city, we'd probably not even be living at this retreat at this point. But it was better to be in numbers so there could be patrols so the others could sleep. And slowly, but very slowly, things got better over several years. Enough thieves had been shot in the countryside that much of the stealing had stopped, but the city was still no place to be. People had learned to provide for themselves. And even people in the cities began raising chickens in their backyards and learning how to garden to supplement the food deliveries that the government would regularly bring in. And people had learned that the majority of what we took for granted before were luxuries, such as restaurants on every corner and cable TV and soft drinks at every meal and prepackaged foods. And as time passed, things slowly got better. Businesses started opening up again and jobs were slowly starting to come back. And the price of food started dropping again, and people could sometimes, as a special treat, actually afford real food again instead of the beans and rice and cornbread and whatever they could grow again. And as more businesses began opening, more banks and office buildings started reopening in the cities, and some people actually began moving back to the cities again. But even with these new jobs, unemployment was still sky high, and America's infrastructure was still mostly a complete mess. And as our daily lives grinded on trying to survive, we also saw many freedoms disappear. Many laws had been passed to give the government the ability to better monitor people so they could hopefully thwart the next terrorist attack. There were checkpoints in most crowded parts of the cities where people were subject to pat-downs and spot searches. Going into the major part of a city was much like trying to board an airplane in the past. It was long lines, and pretty much every car, every briefcase, every piece of luggage, or any other container was searched before somebody was allowed through that checkpoint into the business district of that city. And police were also no longer required to get a search warrant if they were told that a home contained illegal items such as explosives or illegal firearms. And families with a vendetta against another household would falsely tell the police that the other household contained illegal contraband. And the police would just go and bust in and ransack that house, only to leave empty-handed most of the time. And as time went on, most of the retreat group remained living at the retreat. It was just easier to visit the nearest town for medical stuff, and several of us even ended up getting jobs inside of the town. And over time, we ended up building more small and simple homes on the retreat. And while they weren't anything fancy, they at least gave everybody a little bit more privacy and their own space. And even though some small jobs had came back, our economy never returned back to what it was before, where in the past the average person lived in their own home and it wasn't unusual to have 2 or 3 cars per home. Now a whole extended family would usually live inside of one home. The parents, the kids, some close relatives, and the grandparents. And it also wasn't unusual for a home to have only one vehicle to share among everybody. We also had stuff like cable TV again and restaurants again, but now it took everybody living in the house pulling together to be able to afford that cable TV, and eating in a restaurant was a special treat instead of a regular weekend thing. So this is life now. There are jobs, but they're still extremely hard to come by. And families all live together and pool together to make ends meet and to have a few amenities that we had before. But life is still hard and it's still dangerous, especially in the cities. And a lot of the infrastructure in many of the cities are still crumbling. Many of the roads are full of chuck holes, sidewalks are crumbling, and weeds are growing up everywhere. And only in the immediate business districts do you actually see any really nice buildings or nice restaurants. So now people have just accepted that life is like living in a third world country, and that's the norm now. But we're surviving. People called us crazy before the attacks, but in the end, we fared much better than the average person who was forced to remain in the dangerous cities. Many of those people mostly subsided off of food that they could scrounge, or the meager food that was handed out by the government, and they had to live in areas that saw homicide rates rise to the same levels as some of the worst countries in Central America. In some of the cities, the police were being paid so little and given such poor equipment or no equipment at all that it was not unusual to see entire police departments to go on strike. And then when that happened, the amount of crimes and homicides would skyrocket so high that families had to remain hidden inside of their homes until the government would send the military in to regain control of that city. And then one late night at the retreat, and after the typical hard day's work of trying to keep the place operational, me and my family were sleeping when I was awakened by noise coming from the chicken coop. I didn't think too much about it, as it was not unusual for the chickens to make a lot of ruckus anytime a predatory animal was trying to get into their coop. Plus we still had our nighttime patrols around our retreat going, so we felt pretty safe to sleep at night. Looking back, I shouldn't have let myself get so lax and just brush it off as just another raccoon trying to get into the coop. Irritated, I got up out of bed and I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight and my handheld radio and headed towards the chicken coop. As I approached the coop, they were still making a lot of noise, and I figured I was about to shoot a raccoon or something. As I shined my flashlight into the chicken coop, suddenly I lit up and startled a guy who immediately pointed his gun at me. I wasn't expecting this. I was expecting just another raccoon or possum like dozens of times before, and this guy had his gun pointing at me before I had time to get my gun fully at the ready. We both just kind of stood there in silence for a few moments. He's standing there in the chicken coop with his gun already pointed at me, and I'm standing there with my shotgun in my hand at low ready, and I have him lit up with my flashlight. Just by sheer coincidence of how I approached the chicken coop, I was now blocking his quickest escape from out of our retreat. "Just let me leave and I won't have to hurt you," he said. My mind was now racing. Your options always race in your head so fast when you're at gunpoint. Should I just let him leave? Should I try to engage him? Is he really wanting to leave without shooting me? Or is he just trying to get a more advantageous point for himself? Will he still end up shooting me even if I do step aside to unblock his escape? Then suddenly it hits me. While my gun is still at the low ready, I still got my flashlight trained on him. He probably only sees the bright light from my flashlight. He probably can't see me at all or even see that I have a firearm. Now the moment of truth comes. I have to decide, should I try to see if I can shoot him and hope he isn't able to shoot me back? Or should I step aside and let him escape and hope he doesn't shoot me once I open his path of escape?